Welcome to Religion in the American Experience, a podcast that explores how religion has shaped America and how America has shaped religion, which can help us as we wrestle with complex questions of American governance and purpose in the 21st century. Here's your host, Chris Stevenson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Religion in the American Experience, a podcast that explores how religion has shaped America and how America has shaped religion. This year, during America's 250th anniversary, we are paying particular attention to how religion figured into the people and events of the country's founding. In May of 1776, Presbyterian minister John Witherspoon gave a unique sermon entitled "The Dominion of Providence over the Passions of Men," which created quite a stir. What is in this sermon that would raise eyebrows? Who exactly was John Witherspoon, and what influence did the sermon and preacher have on the creation of the United States? We believe that understanding this thread in America's religious fabric will make each of us more effective stewards of religion's role in the American experiment in self-government. For today's episode, I am joined by Gideon Mailer, professor of history at the University of Minnesota. His research and interests include the evolution of liberty, beginning with the ancient Anglo-Scottish constitutional framework and culminating in the establishment of the United States of America. Gideon is the author of The Character of Freedom, the Scottish Enlightenment and American Slavery, and John Witherspoon's American Revolution. Thanks, Gideon, for taking the time to share your understanding and expertise with us today.
Thank you for having me today. It's an honor.
First, Gideon, tell us who John Witherspoon is and where he fits and his significance on the historical landscape up to his giving this sermon in May of 1776.
Sure. Well, most famously, Witherspoon was the only clergyman to sign the American Declaration of Independence, born in 1723. And by the 1750s, he'd become the leader of what's come to be known as the evangelical faction of the Church of Scotland, back in Scotland. And a key figure in that establishment, an institution, the Church of Scotland, that's trying to maintain its autonomy religiously and constitutionally, even though Scotland has lost its parliament to the British Parliament after 1707. So he's grown up in a world where religious matters have important constitutional underpinnings within the independent institution of the Church, even when the Scottish Parliament isn't as independent as it had once been. And so Witherspoon is an early evangelical. He's focusing on the need for salvation from sin, as defined by the Presbyterian Westminster Confession of Faith, and really emphasizing the inability of individuals to act morally without saving grace. And here historians tend to distinguish him from those that are sometimes called the moderates of the Church of Scotland, as well as similar folks in the colonial America and eventually the United States, who focus more on the individual ability to act morally, even without salvation and without being saved and without going through a salvation experience. Witherspoon, as a revivalist, is trying to focus more on God's role in human morality. He moves over to New Jersey in 1768 with his family to become president of the College of New Jersey, later known as Princeton, as a guy that's supposed to unite the evangelical and the Enlightenment-focused factions of Christians in the institution and more broadly in American Presbyterian life. And he comes to preside over what's come to be known as a seminary of sedition, one of the most politicized university and college campuses during the colonial era. It's kind of a crossroads between New England, the South, and the Middle colonies, where different, mainly Protestants of different denominations come together in a unique environment, both in terms of the different kinds of Protestants under Witherspoon's tutelage and ministry, but also where they're talking about politics and linking that religion to politics to a greater extent. And so that's Witherspoon, who'd once fought on behalf of the British Union in 1745 against the Jacobites in Scotland, eventually turns against that union in 1776. And this Dominion of Providence sermon in May 1776 is a key stepping stone on his journey towards defining the political theology of why American independence is legitimate in his eyes, despite having so recently supported the kind of Protestant unity of the British Imperial Union.
Okay, that's super helpful. And so this College of New Jersey, was that the place where these Protestants from the North, Middle, and South were congregating in this, what did you call it, something of sedition?
A seminary of sedition. Yes, that's a phrase that we think is actually used at the time. So it's a historically contemporaneous phrase. And these are people like James Madison, who starts off as an Episcopalian in the South, but he studies Hebrew under Witherspoon, for example, as what I like to call America's first grad student after he graduates. People like Samuel Stanhope Smith, other founders, many of the future Supreme Court justices, and all these people, they're coming as Congregationalists from New England, as Presbyterians, part of that big new wave of Ulster-Scottish and Scottish Presbyterians who've been coming over as the largest single migration wave over the previous half century, as well as even Anglicans or Episcopalians, Dutch Reformed, Dutch Calvinists. And that's really the College of New Jersey, which comes to be known as Princeton, that is providing this ecumenical Protestant culture.
Okay, so it sounds like he had great influence on people who then left Princeton College of New Jersey and went out and helped with the founding of the country. Is that about right?
Yeah, James Madison most famously. So you could even argue that some of Madison's work in the Constitution, his stuff like the seeds of faction are sown in the nature of man. You could argue there's Calvinist understandings of human fallibility and sin, and the need to place sin against itself in order to create a more perfect union. You could argue in part is from Witherspoon and his influence over a key figure like Madison.
Right. Okay. Let's move on to his sermon, The Dominion of Providence over the Passions of Men, again given in May of 1776. Where was it given? Do we know who was there listening that day, and who read it afterwards?
Yeah, so this is May 17th, 1776. It's a fast day appointed by the Continental Congress, who is appointed one fast day before this, the First Continental Congress. So the congressmen get together in order to appoint official days where people are supposed to refrain from work, refrain from eating, and to be very serious, to kind of give thanks to God's help in any political crisis so far, as well as hoping for divine providence and help and grace in any future conflict that may be taking place. And so this was the Second Continental Congress has passed a resolution under New Jersey delegate William Livingston, I believe, and it's technically defined as a, quote, national day of humiliation, fasting and prayer, and it's observed across the colonies. And so this is the context for it. And then we're in First Presbyterian Church of Princeton, New Jersey. So Witherspoon's wearing his black robe, his white Geneva preaching bands. And First Presbyterian is known today as Nassau Presbyterian Church. It's located several yards from Nassau Hall, the home of the College of New Jersey, now known as Princeton. So in the audience are students, trustees of the College of New Jersey, other future signatories of the Declaration of Independence, such as Richard Stockton, and dozens, if not more than 100 people. And it's a very long sermon. It's several pages when it's printed out, so long for its time. And it takes on a life of its own after Witherspoon's publisher, a former English associate who's now living in Pennsylvania, Robert Aitken, publishes it for him in Philadelphia. But it's published in many different print runs on both sides of the Atlantic, interestingly, which tells its own story. It's quite popular in Scotland and England, as well as in North America. It's a popular sermon in North America because it's defining why it is that the colonists deserve their independence. But it's also quite popular in Britain because it's saying, even though Americans deserve their independence from Britain, they're not necessarily morally superior to the British subjects. The British could perhaps actually learn something from the shock of independence on how to reform their own ways.
Interesting. Okay. So Witherspoon uses Psalm 76:10 as the basis for his sermon, which is this: surely the wrath of man shall praise thee, the remainder of wrath shalt thou restrain. According to him, how does this particular scripture help colonists during their, as he says, present situation? Why would he choose this scripture?
So he's trying to show God's providence will grant American victory in the struggle for independence. And so wrath, which is the anger and the rancor that is now having cousins threatening to essentially kill each other, people who are the same family, what Witherspoon in the sermon described as the same in religion, the same in complexion, are threatening to turn on each other. That's wrath. but that actually will praise God, because even though people are fighting each other, and even though the wrath of the colonists against the British is justified in terms of what the potential corruption of what the British are doing over the previous decade, it doesn't mean that the colonists themselves have any hand in defining their own moral superiority, like I've already begun to hint. So anger between different individuals and warring parties is rough, but it still can glorify God because it's providential. So it's not to say that somehow God has lost control because people are fighting each other, but rather that civil war amongst people is providential and designed to move history forward. It's designed for universal sin, which the American colonists and the British both share, to manifest in that sin taking its role in terms of the way that the British are behaving towards the American colonists. It doesn't mean that the colonists are any lesser sinners. It just means that sin happens to be manifesting in one particular way amongst the British, so that annoys the colonists to make them then react with wrath. But this is all still providential. It's different forms of wrath and sin between two people, but that God is using to direct towards a historical event, which Witherspoon is describing as a unprecedented move towards independence of a people that were once part of an empire, which has never really happened before in this way. But let's not ever suggest that God's directing the colonists' wrath against the British is somehow a sign that they're making the choice to move this along in the way that they're choosing, but rather that it's God's choosing, and that if they forget that, they will somehow view themselves as having too much political and moral agency, which only God can have. These are, of course, religious and philosophical problems that other preachers like Jonathan Edwards have been wrestling with. How does providence work out in human affairs? Do humans ever have any real moral role? He's saying, don't ever forget that you are still sinners as well. And even though you deserve independence, because God's providence has generated that independence through playing one form of wrath against another, but remember, you could soon turn against yourselves quickly enough if you don't maintain your own salvation.
That's interesting and probably foreign to a lot of our ears. You mentioned twice now it was important that they didn't see, like the American side or the colonist side did not see themselves as morally superior to the British. You mentioned that twice. Tell me a little bit more about that. They're both sinners. Is that what?
Yes. So,
okay.
Going back to even Jonathan Edwards, a Congregationalist, but he was a great friend of this Scottish world that Witherspoon's come out of, and even Edwards is sometimes called an honorary Presbyterian. Sinners in the hands of an angry God. So we often think of the American Revolution and of sermons during the Revolution as anti-republic, as pro-republican, meaning anti-monarch. But Witherspoon makes clear in the sermon that what the British state is doing, which he hints is actually probably more the Parliament than the Crown, is corrupt. But he implores his listeners in New Jersey, but in the colonies as a whole, because he knows this is going to be circulated to all of them, different sorts of Protestant denominations. He implores them, don't focus on corrupt ministers. Don't focus on, quote, a haughty monarch. Those are his words. Don't focus on the corruption of the monarchy, or even more so the Parliament, which is really what he's focused on, because Witherspoon isn't quite anti-monarchical yet. And that's a whole nother story. He's anti-Parliament, but not quite against the British monarch fully at this point, like many colonists who consider themselves patriots are not. But by saying, don't define yourself against the corruption of monarchs or the politicians, he's saying, yes, they are corrupt, but that's just God manifesting a corruption that you also share in a particular way. So yes, you might not have that manifestation in your political world, in your economic world, in your cultural world that allows your independence. But stop just focusing on the fact that it's a corrupt government that you're moving away from, because that will then make you think, oh, well, once you get rid of that government, then there's no more corruption where we are. But that's not the case, because once you get rid of a corrupt monarch, the corruption will still flow through you in different ways as equal sinners in need of salvation. So he's almost trying to say, let's almost move away from the political context of the revolution in the way that some of the patriots are focusing on corrupt ministers and say, yes, they're corrupt, but that's God's providence that's making them corrupt. And that providence doesn't mean that you are also not corrupt in different ways, which could be your undoing, even though you deserve independence.
Okay. And this they understood. Everyone's corrupt. Everyone's a sinner, right? That this would have rang true, but
he's trying to make them understand that lest they forget, lest that they are defining themselves, which he is worried about. We know he's worried about because he says he is, that the patriot movement will become too focused on glorifying what theologians sometimes describe as a public covenant. People are covenanted in a public way where you are all blessed just by living in a particular place and you don't have to do anything more other than just being born there. No, there's duty to work out your own salvation, despite the public providential blessings that you may receive in terms of gaining your independence and being unified against this increasingly corrupt British state. Doesn't mean that you don't have stuff as individuals to work out in terms of your own sin. So he kind of knows that they know this, but he's worried that sometimes they're going to start focusing on their own political and moral superiority and forget their own individual sin that still remains.
Okay. Wow. Fascinating. Thank you for that explanation and elaboration. That's something to think about for sure. So how does so let's see. You may have answered this question, but I'm going to ask it in case if there's anything else you want to say about it. Why does Witherspoon spend a good portion of his sermon pointing out how the wrath of man praises God, and how does he do it? Again, I think you have addressed this. Anything else?
Touch on a couple more things, I guess. So he says the lust of domination should be so violent and universal. So we're being dominated by a corrupt, centralizing establishment. But be careful, once we get rid of that, that's God's providence allowing us to get rid of that. But it doesn't mean that corruption won't then flow into a lust of domination that we then have. Are we then going to create a big centralized government with a few people taking control of it, who somehow don't think that they're also sinners? That's number one, something that speaks that idea of the wrath of man. But also, the wrath of man praising God is something that Witherspoon would have used in his previous sermons back in Scotland, to try and remind Scottish people in the new British Union that, yes, you're doing well, you're commercially well, you're part of this new British Empire. That's all providence. But still you're sinners. Particularly if you in Scotland are still maintaining some kind of attention with your cousins back in your southern cousins in England. Don't worry. Even though you are maybe more superior than them in certain ways or justified in requiring certain aspects of your independence, it doesn't mean that you still are not capable of wrath as well. It's about giving warnings to people while also saying that whatever happens, it will glorify God. Even if Americans suddenly start fighting each other, having fought the British, that will still be divine providence and will be to create something else new and important, maybe a new kind of American government that is more pure. But that wrath that you can see amongst cousins, that may eventually be amongst you yourselves as independent Americans, is a sign of the universality of sin that you share with everyone else in the world, but is also something that God is still directing as well.
Okay. All right. Really helpful.
You need to acknowledge that God is directing that wrath. It's the acknowledgement that God is directing your wrath is what will allow you to then react to it in a way that will kind of temper your sin and push forward that point of chaos as far ahead into the future as can possibly be the case in any union.
Okay. All right. Helpful. Now, this question I think you also addressed, but let me ask it in case there's additional things you want to share. How does Witherspoon apply these principles? I'm quoting now, I think from his sermon. How does he, quote, apply these principles to their present situation, close quote, including spending considerable time on personal salvation? Again, you have mentioned a little bit of this. Anything else you want to add here?
Yeah, that present situation phrase is important because this is the first time that Witherspoon is bringing religion and politics directly together.
Okay.
He's written under pseudonyms. He's written anonymously to different colonial newspapers and even newspapers back in London to try and tell these British subjects that he still wants to be part of this union, just telling them to get their act together, to attend to their own salvation in a way that will make them act less corrupt against the British, and thus will make this about not a movement towards independence, but about bringing us back together again. So it's his first time now that he's directly, under his own name, linking theological precepts that we've discussed to the political context, the simple context, which is, yes, Americans deserve more independence, particularly from the British Parliament. So that's one important key thing that we shouldn't forget. This is the first time he's saying God is directing Providence to say we do deserve some form of more independence, at least from the British Parliament and possibly even from the British monarchy, although we could still maybe find a way to be under the same Protestant monarchy even in May 1776, which sometimes that many forget that patriots are still thinking this a month or two before the Declaration of Independence. And another thing that I just briefly mention is Witherspoon actually puts a footnote on this sermon, because the sermon begins noting that many eminent Christians, I think is his word, left persecution for where the gospel and true religion were previously unknown, but where it could be kind of more purely understood. And he's talking there about New England, which is interesting. He's a Scottish Presbyterian talking about freedom coming from New England Congregationalists moving to a place where they can work out their salvation more freely. Meaning freedom doesn't mean the right to do what you like. Freedom means the right to understand the sin that you have and the right to be able to work that out on your own individual terms reading the Bible. Okay. So the right not to be mediated in your salvation experience by too many kind of intermediary figures, establishment figures, bishops, that kind of thing. So that's kind of a New England congregational story, but Witherspoon puts a footnote on the sermon when it's published across North America and into Britain and even Europe, which is to say, lest this is a temporizing compliment to the people of New England, meaning if you think I'm trying to make the people of New England think they're the ones that are bringing religious freedom and then connecting that to the American Revolution, I actually use this same kind of motif in sermons I gave 20 years ago in Scotland as a Presbyterian, meaning this is about different sorts of Protestants, not just one Protestant, that is connecting their freedom of religion, the right to work out your salvation to God without an establishment telling you what to do, and connecting that to the kind of economic and political aspect of the revolution, not being told what to do by two powerful establishments. So the political and the economic is now for the first time connected to the religious. Centralized power economically and politically could also centralize power over the individual conscience and take away the power of individuals to work out their salvation. But he's saying, I was making that point back in Scotland. So this is not just something that New England Congregationalists are bringing to the American Revolutionary Patriot Coalition. This is something that I, as a Presbyterian, who actually will be the only clergyman to sign the Declaration, bringing to the situation. And by the way, all those Scottish Presbyterians from Ulster and Scotland, who are going to be some of the largest number of fighters in the Revolutionary Wars, are also listening to this to know that they have a conception of freedom that's economic, political, and cultural, and that all comes down to not being micromanaged by a centralizing establishment, all of which will somehow impinge upon your salvation. And he's making this point for the first time publicly.
That's really interesting how much from your explanation he is linking most of what he's saying politically to the idea of working out one's salvation. That was his main concern, it seems like, right?
Working out your salvation, but also realizing that it's God's providence that is providing the overarching framework that you are reacting to and responding to in order to work out your salvation. That God is making all of this chaos paradoxically to provide a light for you to understand your sin and to be free to understand that darkness within you to then get light. It's kind of a paradox.
Yeah. So Gideon, he ends with some exhortations to duty. Can you highlight some of those that you find most important?
Yeah. So when we're talking about duty, often even in some of these sermons, we're often thinking about it like in a classical sense. All these colonists, even those who have had not even a tertiary education, would be familiar with the idea of duty as somehow moving individuals away from their own personal ego towards something communitarian beyond them. That's like the classical understanding of how you get a strong republic, individuals moving beyond their passions towards something beyond them. But he's trying to put a sort of Christian or Judeo-Christian spin on this by saying duty to God enables you to situate yourself outside of your individual passions, ego, towards something outside of yourself. And that can be the American Union that's becoming independent. So duty is both individual, because it's the individual's duty to understand that their own sin is separate from every other individual and separates themselves from other individuals. So it's very individualistic. But that individual freedom to acknowledge your duty to God's grace and your duty to God for having given you that grace is also the only thing that can connect you to everyone else who's doing the same thing and can make you communitarian. So individual acknowledgement of sin situates you outside of your individual self if all the other individuals are free to do that same thing individually, and connects you within a community. Same thing like that these classical theorists are saying, like classical virtues doing the same. But now we have duty, which is individuals have a duty to God and God's ability to give you grace. And so you have a duty to be grateful for that grace and be essentially born again, to be saved from your sin. But that's a duty because being saved from your sin makes you a better citizen and makes you more likely to be less of a problem for the other citizens around you, and thus makes you less likely to create a problem for any new republic, just like the classical theorists are saying from a kind of classical context.
Okay. All right. Very helpful. So what were the effects, Gideon, of this sermon as far as we can tell from the historical record?
Yeah, so super important. It's widely circulated. Many different editions in the colonies, which become the independent United States, but also in Britain. Ironically, one of the effects is that some patriots say, is Witherspoon really as much of a patriot as we are? Because he's trying to bring the colonists and as independent Americans closer together with their British subjects. Meaning, he's saying, yes, they deserve their independence, but they're also sinners that share something with those British subjects. And so is he trying to actually make us best buddies before we've even finished this revolution? That's what some people are saying. Some people are saying he's trying to reconcile Scotland particularly to any independent United States. So Witherspoon has to kind of fight against that. But more generally, it's very important, I think, for the ecumenical language within it, that Providence is something that connects not just Presbyterians living in one province of the empire, whether that's Scotland or New Jersey, but it's different sorts of Protestants. And Witherspoon makes that point specifically. He's saying freedom really comes when different denominations come together rather than just one denomination. Even though I love my one denomination, it's about different denominations coming together, and that's what freedom can mean. And that's what God's providence really wants. And that is something that can obviously unify there's one Catholic signatory to the Declaration, but these are going to be primarily Protestants trying to justify a revolution against another primarily Protestant union, and to unify the different Protestants that are in the United States in all the different colonies. That's something that this language of providence and sin can do. Because if you're all sinners, it doesn't matter if you're a Congregationalist or a Methodist or a Baptist or a Presbyterian, and so on and so forth. Also, the link between economic freedom and religious freedom that Witherspoon makes, I think, is important. The idea that when you give up civil freedom, your conscience may also be under threat, because that's something that the founders will really become extremely concerned with. And it's one of the things that they're not going to give up. For example, in the Bill of Rights, it's going to be conscience that really will never be able to be gotten rid of, even while you might have something like martial law that can control your other freedom of movement and political rights. And you could even have your property taken away from you under certain contexts, but conscience, no. Witherspoon makes the case that when you have a centralizing power over your conscience, that's going to also take away your property and your money. And that's always a popular thing for people to hear who see themselves as kind of polite and commercial people. And this is something that Witherspoon's been saying as a Scot in Scotland 20 to 30 years earlier. We as Scots who've joined the British Union are free to commercially trade and to get essentially richer, but we're also free to maintain our specific role as Presbyterians, despite all the other Protestants within this imperial union and in this British state. Now the United States is going to say the same thing, in part thanks to sermons like this and reading them and schooling people in them, which is we're going to come together under economic freedom, political freedom, but not necessarily if that centralizing power takes it away.
Right. Do you think people in the pews that were listening to him were surprised by what they heard?
Yes. We know from people like Ezra Stiles, who was from Yale, who heard and read the sermon subsequently. They were surprised by the extent which Witherspoon is telling people not to focus on the haughty monarch or the parliament as corrupt. The thing that's really uniting people up to now, the fact that he's telling them, don't get carried away with focusing on the corruption of specific British politicians, because it's always seductive to focus on one politician, one monarch, one president as corrupt, and you get rid of them, then we're all going to be good and pure. But he's telling them don't. And so people are surprised by that he's almost, before the revolution has started, he's focusing Americans on why it is that they're not so morally great themselves. I mean, they need to remember that while they should and deserve their independence.
And were they surprised that he brought politics and religion together? Do you think they were surprised by that? Or were they sort of expecting something like that at this point?
Well, in the Parliament, there's a famous quotation that Horace Walpole in the British Parliament may or may not have said, that cousin America has run off with a Presbyterian parson, meaning Witherspoon has convinced all these other patriots to become zealous Calvinists, connecting religion and politics together in a way that they've not necessarily been doing so before. Maybe forgetting what the Puritan New Englanders have been doing, of course. But there is this idea that there is a surprise in Britain that this guy is connecting it together so closely when he hasn't before, and when ministers have often not wanted to do this because they want to show themselves as concerned with salvation, with religious matters, not with worldly matters. They're going to be the ones that are prophets talking about the Bible. But now that Witherspoon's connecting Providence to specific matters is kind of new, but still he's doing so in a way to remind people of these more transient biblical notions of providence and the need for individual salvation.
Okay, great. Last question, Gideon. I ask all of our guests, do you want to share any lessons or takeaways from your understanding of Witherspoon's sermon, The Dominion of Providence over the Passions of Men, either in terms of important historical transformations you have noticed or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment in the American narrative?
Yeah, and I'll be quick. I guess the paradoxical nature of American exceptionalism and what liberty means. Liberty as the right to perform and the freedom to perform your duty to God. That's liberty with a duty. And we don't often think of freedom as connected to a duty to do something. A duty, you're free to work out your salvation to God, to understand the providence that is helping you to work out that salvation to God. It's all very circular as well. And that notion of American exceptionalism is somehow Witherspoon helping Americans try and understand patriots, potentially enslaved as well as free. You could even have enslaved Black patriots reading this who are also asking for their freedom, who can see this notion of universal sin as somehow freeing, because I'm as much of a sinner as my enslaver, for example. But also that idea of we are more free as colonists because God's given us the grace to understand the sin that we share with people back in the old world. So we deserve independence from people precisely because we understand something that we share with them. That's kind of gives food for thought.
Yeah.
And then also this idea of Witherspoon warning people, like I mentioned before, don't necessarily get obsessed with focusing on the corruption of the specific king, the specific government leader. That is indulgent almost. Because if you focus on getting rid of that one political leader as somehow the epitome of all corruption, all humans will have some kind of ego and passion. And don't for 1 second think that when we get rid of King George, or actually it would be the governors and the politicians that they'd really have their mind on, that somehow we're all going to be good. Because it becomes about, it can be too often, and we see this, of course, in ever since and today, maybe, not to get too portentous, with people focusing their ire on one politician from one ideology or another, somehow divorcing you from the own passions and ego that we would all as individuals potentially have as well, even if that boogeyman is gone, as it were. And that's what Witherspoon's really trying to make clear to patriots.
Do you think they listened?
They did. They were worried about the Union falling apart too quickly. Particularly Madison and others were worried about falling apart. The classical theorists have told them this, but also this kind of Calvinist idea is telling them this as well, that if we become too focused on our own moral superiority, having vanquished ourselves from the corruption of British governors, we'll then create the same government ourselves if we're not too careful. And maybe that's part of the theological context for where the kind of the big government, the small government idea can come from. Are we going to create the same corruption that we've had with the British Empire, just in our own way, because we thought that we're so moral by having gotten rid of those specific political leaders?
Right.
But then generations then, of course, forget that message, and going to be 6 or 7 decades later that these same churches will be burning again in the Civil War, of course.
Okay, Gideon, you have the last word, and it was a good one. We have been talking with Gideon Mailer, professor of history at the University of Minnesota and author of John Witherspoon's American Revolution. Gideon, thanks so much. The explanations you've given were just, I think, what we needed to hear, and they have equipped us to be better stewards of religion's role in perpetuating the American experiment in self-government.
Thank you.
Religion in the American Experience is produced by the private Digital First National Museum of American Religion. Scholarly support is provided by Dr. Lauren Turek and audio and video assistance by Dr. Randall Stevens. The music was composed by Evan Chamberlain.